I'm Nina van Tilburg for Biznews. Economic freedom fight leader Julius Malema has long been a vocal supporter of a socialist form of government, often citing Cuba as an example of the direction he envisions for South Africa if his party were to become the majority party. In tweets, he described Cuba as a successful socialist state. To shed light on what Malema's vision of South Africa based on the Cuban model might look like, we turn to Professor Christopher Sabatini, a senior research fellow for Latin America and the Americas program at Chatham House. And he also has a long history at Columbia and has associations with Harvard and the LSE. Hi, Dr. Sabatini. So lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Linda. Great to be here.
So, can we ask you, why do some African leaders want to emulate the Cuban example of socialism?
Well, let's first pick apart what model he's holding up as something to be followed. Cuba right now is experiencing more than 100,000 people have left Cuba this year alone, fleeing poverty, inequality. You now actually have malnutrition. It is an economic basket case. It survives really only through tourism, and also the sale or export of doctors to countries. It is the socialist model, and it's mind-boggling when you're there to think that they thought they could build an entire economy, a command economy, in which they would dispatch the technocrats to the rural provinces, determine how much corn should be grown or how much whatever, and then allocate the seeds and allocate all the equipment. Consequently, there are chronic food shortages. If you go to the public markets, the state-owned markets, they're completely barren. And even the so-called myths of the Cuban Revolution that it improved healthcare are simply false. If you go to hospitals, and a friend who had to go to hospital because he thought he had cholera, you have to bring your own bed sheets. There's no medicine. They like to blame the U.S. embargo for this, but that isn't true because they can actually buy medicines and equipment. It is really just about the failure of supply. What its successful model is if you're an autocratic leader who wants to remain in power forever, it's the way you do it. Fidel Castro stormed into the Capitol January 1st, 1959, and he was in power until he resigned, I think around mid-2000s. And then his brother took over, and his brother still is pulling the strings from behind. So it's a successful dictatorial model. It's not a successful economic model.
Well, sometimes when leaders like Malema use Cuba as an example, they talk about the low unemployment rate. So what's behind those figures?
So it's guaranteed employment. It's like they used to say about the Soviet Union, where people pretend to work and the state pretends to pay them. Yes, there is, when the state controls all of the economy, and there have been some efforts to loosen some things. In fact, because the economy is in such dire straits, the government has created, again, very top-down, 350 categories for self-employment. Barbers, restaurateurs, ice cream salespeople, they can now be self-employed because they had a problem of very unproductive growth. But again, when you go, it boggles the mind to think when you go to the island, the stores don't have anything, workers aren't working, roads are in complete disrepair. So yes, officially there's no unemployment, but again, it's a totalitarian country, so they can make up any numbers they want and pretend they're real. They're not if you go.
So it's about where do the numbers come from?
Exactly, and they come from the government, and a government and this is one of the curious things, is the way in which the Cuban Revolution has been very effective at promoting propaganda about itself. Part of that is because Fidel Castro stood up to the Yankees. He became sort of the definition of anti-imperialism. But for example, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economy contracted by 2/3 because it existed simply because of Soviet handouts, providing fuel, buying in sugar at inflated rates. And it still remains really very much a monocultural economy in terms of sugar, tourism. That's pretty much about it. They were
Cigars?
Cigars, yes. Although even their cigars, and this Cubans don't like when I say this, but it's true. If you look at the rankings of the best cigars in the world, of the top 50, only 2 types of Cuban cigars make it anymore. Even their cigar industry has deteriorated.
Well, I've noticed that there was a business owner called Carlos Miguel Pérez. He's also in the Cuban legislature. Well, he highlighted that he's from the Communist Party. Well, how else could you be? The inability of the economy to provide enough food for all. And he mentioned that the state worker's monthly salary is equivalent to the price of a piece of Gouda cheese.
He's probably right. But the problem is they don't have the cheese to buy. So even if they have the money to buy that cheese, there's no cheese. So yes, there is the salaries are very low. They are paid in now. They used to have two currencies. They used to have a convertible peso and then a local peso. They did unify those, but that created all sorts of shortages. It also created a whole series of problems in their central bank. In fact, last year, on June 11th of last year, there were massive protests across the country in Cuba about the shortages of food. It was interesting because it wasn't so much about democracy, which is, in this case, it was about real need and real shortcomings. Over food, over lack of employment, over lack of income. The truth is what really keeps the Cuban regime afloat primarily are remittances. Relatives who live outside Cuba sending food, sending money, and actually even food to via flights to Cuba. What that has meant, though, and this is the real tragic part of, is Cuba, because it was once Cuba is a sugar-producing country. It is a large Afro-descendant population. There's now real discrepancy between Cubans of more European extraction and those Afro-descendants, because many of those who have left are more of European extraction. So those who are getting those remittances to keep people afloat are doing relatively better. Whereas, and I have a friend who actually is South African, who lived in Cuba. She's a researcher. She was just there, and she's telling me that, for the first time now, you have real shanty towns that are springing up on the outskirts of major cities, and you have a real survival problem and malnutrition among Afro-descendant populations in Cuba.
You mentioned that Cuba did better when the Soviet Union was propping it up. Well, what Mr. Malema shares is like this commonality with other leaders who support communist economies, is their relationship with Russia. Well, what benefits does the association with Russia bring to economies like Cuba and African countries such as South Africa? So you say if Mr. Malema come in, where would the Russians come in?
Well, the Russians right now are not interested in having another client state like the Soviet Union had. They're not interested in propping up a fiction of an economy just because it wants to have a satellite country just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. So really, right now, what Russia provides to Cuba is very small amounts of aid. It is shipping oil. Cuba used to also get, this is what was keeping it alive for a long time, it was getting 100,000 barrels a day of oil from Venezuela. But then the Venezuelan economy under Hugo Chavez, who also said he wanted to, and this is a direct quote, he wanted to swim in the sea of happiness towards a Cuban model. Venezuela's economy has contracted by 3/4. At one time, it had inflation of, no joke, annualized 1 million%. It is more than 7 million people have fled Venezuela because of the economic crisis. So that's what the model did for Venezuela. And what it meant was that lifeline of 100,000 barrels of oil a day that were being shipped to Cuba dried up. So now, basically, Russia supplies small amounts of oil, and that's about it. It did send a submarine into a Cuban port, but it just simply does not have the resources to keep Cuba afloat. And China isn't interested in it either. China provided some electricity units and helped in some infrastructure, but China too is really not willing to prop up the economy.
So what Putin promised now with the Africa-Russia summit, he promised some grain free to some countries, and that he will help with grain, as with the war, Ukraine is not enough grain is coming out of the ports. So say Malema comes into power, are you actually saying that, the floodgates aren't going to open from Russia to pour in all kinds of oil, grain, whatever South Africa might need?
They need all of the resources they can get. What you'll get are some token levels of assistance to build allies, but not enough to prop up an economy. And again, consider what it would take in a country like South Africa, as happened in Venezuela, to create a sort of Cuban-style model. You have to not massively expropriate property, businesses, whether it's farms, supermarkets, mining companies, And you cannot run an economy that way. So your other sources of revenue dry up. So what you exchange is a relatively good, well-functioning economy for then basically getting a welfare check every month or so from a equally poor but larger country, and that's Russia.
Well, if Mr. Malema wins the election and pursues this goal of turning South Africa into a social state, you've seen what happened in Cuba, you've seen what happened in other Latin American countries. Can you take us through the likely steps that will happen? You mentioned the expropriation of mining companies, etc., and the impact this would have on the economy, its constitution, and democratic processes.
So let's take the economy first. What would have to be done first is nationalize key sectors of the economy, and particularly the productive ones. Why? Because it means you can employ as many people, so you can sop up unemployment by, even if they're unproductive or unqualified. In the case of Venezuela, for example, former President Hugo Chavez fired all the oil workers, technocrats, engineers, and the like, and then hired partisans. And the oil production has shrunk from 3 million barrels a day to only 700,000 barrels a day now, because of the fact they didn't have any money to invest, because they basically broke the bank of the oil company, and they staffed it with partisan loyalists. So the first thing is you're going to expropriate. The second thing you'll do is you break the independence of the central bank, because, again, you want money, and you want to be able to give away things. So and patronage, clientelism, all of that, you're not actually creating an economy, you're creating a giant patronage machine that you're using to buy votes and buy support. And that works in the short term, but it destroys the economy. And then what you'll do next, and this is always, we saw this in Venezuela, Bolivia, is you rewrite the constitution to remove term limits. Then you can run as often as you want, consolidate power. And, as you are still robbing the state economy, you have enough political popularity to be able to sustain that. Eventually, you run out of, as Margaret Thatcher said, you run out of spending other people's money, and you hit the wall. That's what has happened in Venezuela and Bolivia. Also, there's been a run on the banks in Bolivia, and it's been happening in Cuba for decades now. That's what will happen. And it is, in this sense, it is a model. It is a model that combines total economic control and intervention by the state to be able to generate and create resources and employment, and then also complete control over the government.
And the international reaction, what would that be? Because Cuba has had sanctions for decades.
Since 1961, they haven't worked. It's, and the truth is actually, it's as much as Cuba suffers under the sanctions, it enjoys them, because it does mean that most Americans don't go to Cuba. There isn't that contact. There isn't. There's no competition of ideas. They are able to sort of, it's an island, obviously. They can, basically seal themselves off from the rest of the world. In the case of international reaction, there'll be, again, calls for sanctions, calls for isolation. There'll be those who hope and believe that maybe you can talk to these leaders. And one of the things about Hugo Chavez, for example, he's elected and claimed he wanted to follow the Castro model. There was one well-known businessman once said, "Oh, don't worry about it. As soon as we get a Rolex on his wrist, he'll be like all of us." He wasn't. He was sincere. He really did want to follow the Cuba model. Rolex didn't change a thing. So, there are also those, as Lenin would say, those useful idiots that believe that you can somehow change and steer these dictators, wannabe dictators, in a direction that is much more pragmatic. Often that's not the case. They have a model and they're going to follow it.
And how would China and Russia view it?
Oh, this would be a win for their column. This would be, again, in an effort to create a multipolar world in which basically Russia, China, Venezuela, to a certain extent India, South Africa, in some ways, this is their way of creating a momentum that breaks apart U.S. hegemony and challenges the liberal international order. Not to talk about a book, but I just published a book on reclaiming human rights in a changing world order. And if you look at sort of Russia and China and others, they're actively creating parallel regional organizations or international organizations that challenge human rights norms, that challenge a liberal order. To add another country in their column in that case is a real win.
Well, that's already happening in South Africa. I mean, groups or parties like the EFF are constantly challenging everything in court. Yeah. They're using the courts at the moment, so that's already happening in South Africa. and they already have the Rolexes on their arms.
So it didn't change them, did it? See, that works. Yeah, and that's, I mean, you have obviously the BRICS collection of countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They're now talking about creating, even Lula, the president of Brazil, is talking about creating a parallel currency to break the dominance of the dollar. They're even now trying to engage more in trade with the Chinese renminbi. But what's ironic is two of those countries are democracies, India and Brazil, to a certain extent South Africa, but I think they haven't really fully evaluated the implications of their embrace of patently dictatorial governments.
So do you can we talk about that currency? Do you think it has any chance of challenging the dollar ever, if it comes into being?
I think it could. I mean, there's a lot that has to be done. It will depend on Chinese liquidity. The Chinese are clearly very interested in seeing this happen. They just opened up a credit line for Argentina. Argentina is frozen out of the IMF because it's defaulted on its debt. The renminbi is used for currency between they have a sort of ruble renminbi exchange for Russian and Chinese. They're very slowly chipping away at the dominance of Western currencies, whether the euro, the pound, or the dollar, and trying to sort of replace it with their own currency or even a new currency. One other thing they've done is if we all heard about the SWIFT banking sort of financial transactions that froze Russia out. China has created its own SWIFT banking system called CIS. It's not massive, but it is in fact beginning to serve as a regulator and facilitator of transnational banking transactions.
Oh, well, interesting. Well, if we can get back to Malema and South Africans and how they should view this. So from voters, why would voters be persuaded by this socialist utopia, and how would it affect them if tomorrow South Africa becomes this socialist state?
So, a couple things. First is, it would affect them because their options for food, what they associate with sort of basic consumer goods would deteriorate considerably and would narrow. Fewer options for food, fewer options for supermarkets, shortages. Those will maybe not happen immediately, but they will start to happen within a few years. The second is if you're going to control the economy, you also have to start to control the civic space. And that's key to the longevity of the Castro government in Cuba. So fewer political freedoms, less freedom of expression. The Chavez government in Venezuela, for example, it closed down all the independent newspapers and independent television stations. But it couldn't close them down. It bought them out because it had a lot of money because it had raided the state oil company and bought them out and resold them to favorable interests. So you'd lose free media. And what also happens is that when this is the military becomes more and more involved in civilian life. You have to keep the military sweet. And you do that by giving them control over key economic resources, including illicit economies. That's happened in particular in Venezuela. It's also happened in Bolivia. And you basically create a mafia state. Now, why should they be concerned? First of all, is it creates a high degree of insecurity. Crime in Venezuela. Caracas at one point had the highest murder rate in the world, even more than Iraq. The second is it just simply can't be sustained. It's like a sugar high. Yes, there will be subsidized markets. There will be sort of access to cheaper goods in poor neighborhoods, maybe even medicine, but it can't last. I mean, you can't raid the till and keep it going forever. So eventually, there will be that hangover. And as I say, what it also means is you risk becoming an international pariah. South African citizens, would they rather live in Russia or China, or live in Great Britain, or live in South Africa as they currently enjoy it? And the truth is these are not models that anyone would want to live in or choose to live in. But they may.
Fantastic insights. And you might have to pay your whole salary to buy a block of cheese.
Exactly.
If we can use that analogy.
That's okay. That's okay. As long as I can get the cheese.
Yeah, as long as you get the cheese. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Sabatini, such interesting insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.